The scream that escaped my throat when I opened that basement door will haunt me for the rest of my life. There, chained to a concrete wall in a makeshift prison beneath my own home, was a woman I'd been told was dead for 30 years. My husband's first wife, Martha, was alive, barely breathing, and staring at me with eyes that held 3 decades of unimaginable suffering. Her skeletal frame was wrapped in the rotting remains of what looked like a wedding dress from 1990, and the smell of human waste and despair was so overwhelming that I nearly collapsed on the basement floor. The man I'd shared a bed with for 32 years, raised children with, celebrated holidays with, and trusted with my heart had been keeping his previous wife as a prisoner directly beneath our feet while I lived my entire married life in complete ignorance. Every footstep I'd taken across our beautiful hardwood floors had been directly above a torture chamber where an innocent woman suffered in silence, crying for help that never came. But let me tell you how it all started, because this story will destroy everything you think you know about the person sleeping next to you every night and make you realize that the most dangerous predators are often hiding behind the most respectable facades. My name is Ruth Henderson, and at 74 years old, I thought I knew everything about my husband of 32 years. I live in Salem, Oregon, in a beautiful Victorian house that Robert inherited from his grandmother when we got married in 1991. This house was supposed to be our dream home, a place where we'd grow old together surrounded by the love and laughter of our children and grandchildren. Instead, it became the setting for the most horrific discovery of my life. Robert told me his first wife, Martha, had died in a tragic car accident in 1990, just 1 year before we met at a church social for widowed and divorced individuals. He was still grieving, still wearing his wedding ring on a chain around his neck, and spoke about Martha with such pain and longing that my heart broke for him. He'd show me photographs of a beautiful woman with long brown hair and a radiant smile, telling me stories about their 5-year marriage and how much he'd loved her. I felt so honored that he chose to love again after such devastating loss, so grateful that he was willing to open his heart to another woman despite the trauma of losing his first wife so young. Robert was 45 when we married, and I was 42. Both of us grateful for a second chance at happiness after failed first marriages and years of loneliness. Robert was a respected contractor who owned Henderson Construction Company, a business he'd built from nothing into one of the most successful construction firms in the Pacific Northwest. He was known throughout our community for his integrity, craftsmanship, and charitable work building homes for low-income families through Habitat for Humanity. Every Christmas, he'd organize toy drives for underprivileged children. Every Thanksgiving, he'd volunteer at the local homeless shelter. Everyone in Salem knew Robert as a pillar of the community, a devoted husband, and a man whose tragic first marriage had only made him more compassionate and loving toward others. For 32 years, I believed I was living a fairy tale love story with a man who had overcome tragedy to find happiness again. Our marriage seemed perfect. We rarely fought, shared the same values, and built a beautiful life together that included 2 children from my first marriage who adored Robert and considered him their real father. I was wrong about everything. Before I continue my story, I really want to know where you're watching me from. Tell me in the comments what city you're from, and if you can, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because what I'm about to tell you next will shatter your faith in everything you think you know about the people you trust most. The discovery that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in March when Robert was out of town on a major construction project in Portland. He'd been gone for 3 days, and I was doing my annual spring cleaning, something I'd done religiously every year for 3 decades, but this time I decided to tackle areas of the house I usually left to Robert, including the mysterious basement storage room that he'd always insisted was too dangerous for me to enter. For 32 years, Robert had been incredibly protective about that basement. He'd installed multiple heavy-duty locks on the door, the kind you'd see on a bank vault, and always kept the keys with him on a special key ring that he never let out of his sight. Whenever I asked about going down there, he'd get this strange look in his eyes and firmly explain that the previous owners had left hazardous materials, that there were structural problems with the foundation, and that he was gradually cleaning it out whenever he had time between construction jobs. He'd told me stories about old paint cans filled with lead-based products, asbestos insulation that was dangerous to disturb, and electrical wiring from the 1940s that could cause fires or electrocution if anyone who wasn't an expert tried to navigate the space. As someone who'd never worked in construction, I trusted his expertise completely and never questioned why it was taking him over 3 decades to make the basement safe for basic storage. Robert had even installed a security system with motion detectors and cameras that monitored the basement door, claiming it was necessary to prevent break-ins since the basement had a separate entrance from outside the house. He said burglars often targeted basement areas because they provided easy access to homes and were less likely to be noticed by neighbors or passers-by. But on this particular morning, as I was organizing our bedroom closet, I found Robert's spare key ring hanging on a hook behind his winter coats, where he'd forgotten it during his rushed departure for Portland. Something about finding those keys felt like discovering a secret I wasn't supposed to know existed. After 32 years of marriage, there was finally nothing preventing me from seeing what was behind that locked door. Standing at the top of those basement stairs, with Robert's keys in my trembling hand, I felt like I was about to cross a line that would change everything about my life. The multiple locks on the door were more sophisticated than anything I'd ever seen in a residential home. Heavy-duty deadbolts, chain locks, and even an electronic keypad system that Robert had apparently installed recently. It took me nearly 10 minutes to figure out how to unlock all the security measures, and with each lock that clicked open, I felt a growing sense of unease that I couldn't explain. Why would a basement storage area need this level of security? What could possibly be down there that required the kind of protection Robert had installed? The basement stairs creaked ominously as I descended into the darkness, flashlight in hand, because Robert had always claimed the electrical system down there was unreliable and dangerous. But as I reached the bottom step and my flashlight beam swept across the space, I realized everything Robert had told me about the basement was a lie. This wasn't a hazardous storage area filled with dangerous materials and structural problems. The basement was completely finished, with painted walls, carpeted floors, and modern electrical outlets with working light fixtures. It was divided into several rooms, including what looked like a primitive kitchen area with a small refrigerator, hot plate, and sink. There was a bathroom with a toilet and shower, and what appeared to be a living area with old furniture and a television. But it was the smell that made me realize something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with the odor of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else I couldn't identify, a smell of despair and suffering that seemed to permeate every surface in the basement. As I moved deeper into the space, following the smell and a sound I couldn't quite identify, I discovered a heavy metal door in the far corner that looked like something from a prison. The door had a small window with bars, multiple padlocks, and a slot at the bottom that looked like it was designed for passing food through to someone on the other side. And from behind that door came the sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life, the weak, desperate crying of a human being who had given up hope of ever being rescued. But what I discovered when I opened that door would reveal a crime so horrific, so unthinkable, that it would destroy everything I thought I knew about my marriage and the man I'd loved for over 3 decades. Martha Collins Henderson, Robert's first wife, who I'd been told was dead, was chained to the basement wall, emaciated, barely conscious, and wearing the rotting remains of what looked like a wedding dress from 30 years ago. She was alive, but just barely, sustained by whatever minimal food and water Robert had been providing to keep her alive, but not healthy enough to escape. When Martha saw me, she tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper after years of screaming that no one had heard. The first words she managed to croak out were, "Please, help me. He told me you'd never come down here." The horror of the situation was overwhelming. My husband hadn't just lied about Martha's death. He'd been keeping her as a prisoner in our basement for the entire duration of our marriage. Every night I'd gone to sleep upstairs. She'd been chained in the dark just feet below me. Every family dinner, every holiday celebration, every moment of happiness I'd experienced in that house had occurred while an innocent woman suffered in unimaginable captivity beneath my feet. But the worst realization was still coming. Martha's captivity wasn't random or impulsive. This was a carefully planned, methodically executed crime that Robert had been perfecting for 30 years. As I freed Martha from her chains with bolt cutters I found in Robert's workshop, she began telling me the truth about what had happened to her and why Robert had never let me into the basement. Her story was so horrific that I could barely comprehend how the man I'd loved could be capable of such evil. Martha and Robert had been married for 5 years when she discovered that he was embezzling money from his construction company's clients, overcharging elderly customers and keeping the excess payments for himself. When she threatened to report his crimes to the authorities, Robert didn't try to convince her to stay quiet or promise to change his behavior. Instead, he drugged her coffee one morning in 1990, carried her unconscious body to the basement, and chained her to the wall where she'd remained for 33 years. Robert had told everyone that Martha died in a car accident, even holding a fake funeral with a closed casket that actually contained concrete blocks. He'd collected life insurance money, sold her personal belongings, and used the proceeds to renovate the basement into a more secure prison where he could keep her indefinitely. But Martha's imprisonment wasn't just about silencing a witness to his financial crimes. She revealed details about Robert's psychology and motivations that made me realize I'd been living with a monster who was far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. Robert was a sadist who derived pleasure from Martha's suffering and fear. He'd visit her daily, sometimes bringing food and water, sometimes just coming down to taunt her about how no one would ever find her or believe she was still alive. He'd tell her about his new wife, me, and describe our happy marriage while she lay chained in the darkness below. He'd shown Martha photos of our children and grandchildren, describing family celebrations and milestones while she missed 30 years of her own life. He'd even brought her newspaper clippings about community events where he was honored for his charitable work, forcing her to read about how respected and beloved he was while she remained his secret prisoner. The psychological torture was as systematic and cruel as the physical imprisonment. Robert had deliberately designed Martha's captivity to maximize her suffering while ensuring she remained alive enough to continue experiencing that suffering indefinitely. But what Martha told me next revealed that her imprisonment was just part of a much larger pattern of criminal behavior that had been hidden beneath Robert's respectable public image. During her years in the basement, Martha had overheard Robert conducting business meetings in the house above her, including conversations about other victims he'd exploited and abused. She'd heard him planning financial scams, discussing ways to defraud elderly clients, and even talking about other women he'd considered kidnapping if they threatened to expose his crimes. Robert hadn't just been keeping one victim in our basement. He'd been operating a criminal enterprise that targeted vulnerable people throughout our community, using his reputation as a respected contractor to gain access to victims and exploit their trust. Martha had heard Robert talking on the phone about offshore bank accounts where he'd hidden millions of dollars stolen from construction clients over 3 decades. She'd overheard conversations about forged documents, fake insurance claims, and elaborate schemes to defraud government housing programs designed to help low-income families. The man I'd believed was a charitable community leader was actually a predator who'd been systematically robbing and exploiting the most vulnerable people in our town while keeping his first wife as a prisoner to prevent her from exposing his crimes. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Robert had been planning to murder Martha and make me his next victim once I became too old to be useful to his criminal operations. Martha had overheard Robert talking to someone about disposing of the basement problem and finding a way to retire me once I reached an age where I might become suspicious of his activities or too frail to maintain the household that provided cover for his crimes. I wasn't Robert's beloved second wife. I was an unwitting accomplice who provided respectability and cover for his criminal activities, and I was being set up to become his next victim once my usefulness expired. The realization that my entire marriage had been built on lies and that I'd been living in the same house as a victim of ongoing torture and imprisonment was devastating beyond description. But I knew I had to get Martha medical attention immediately and ensure that Robert faced justice for his crimes. If this story is shocking you, hit that subscribe button because what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about the people in your own community. I called 911 and told them I'd found a kidnapping victim in my basement. Within minutes, my house was swarming with police officers, paramedics, FBI agents, and crime scene investigators who could barely believe what they were seeing. Martha was rushed to Salem Hospital, where doctors determined that she was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from multiple health problems caused by 30 years of imprisonment and neglect. She had broken bones that had never been properly treated, infections from the chains that had rubbed her skin raw, and psychological trauma that would require years of therapy to address. But despite her physical condition, Martha was mentally sharp and able to provide detailed information about Robert's crimes, his criminal associates, and the location of evidence that would expose the full scope of his illegal activities. Detective Sarah Martinez, who was assigned to lead the investigation, told me this was one of the most complex criminal cases she'd ever encountered. The evidence Martha provided led to search warrants for Robert's business offices, storage facilities, and bank accounts that revealed a criminal empire spanning 3 decades. Robert's construction company had been a front for elaborate fraud schemes that had stolen an estimated $12 million from clients, government programs, and insurance companies. He'd been overcharging elderly customers, submitting false insurance claims for work that was never performed, and using substandard materials while billing clients for premium construction supplies. But the financial crimes were just part of Robert's criminal activities. Police discovered that he'd been blackmailing several prominent community members who'd hired his construction company, using information he'd gained access to during home renovations to extort money and favors from his victims. The investigation also revealed that Robert had been planning Martha's murder for months, having purchased supplies that would have allowed him to dispose of her body and eliminate the evidence of her 30-year imprisonment. When Robert returned from his Portland construction job 2 days later, he walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. Police had positioned officers throughout our neighborhood, and FBI agents were waiting inside our house to arrest him the moment he walked through the door. The look on Robert's face when he realized his crimes had been exposed was a mixture of rage, panic, and calculation that made me understand I'd never really known the man I'd been married to for 32 years. Robert initially tried to claim that Martha's imprisonment was somehow consensual, that she'd agreed to live in the basement to hide from people who were trying to hurt her. But the physical evidence of chains, locks, and the prison-like conditions made it impossible to maintain that fiction. When confronted with evidence of his financial crimes and the testimony Martha had provided about his criminal activities, Robert's demeanor changed completely. The charming, caring husband I'd known disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating criminal who showed no remorse for the suffering he'd caused. During his interrogation, Robert admitted to imprisoning Martha, but claimed he'd had no choice because she was threatening to destroy his reputation with false accusations about his business practices. He showed no empathy for Martha's suffering and seemed primarily concerned about the impact his arrest would have on his construction company and community standing. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Robert was a textbook psychopath who had spent decades carefully constructing a false public persona while hiding his true nature as a predator and criminal. Robert was charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and multiple counts of elder abuse related to his exploitation of elderly construction clients. The prosecution argued that his crimes represented one of the most elaborate and long-running criminal enterprises in Oregon state history. But the legal proceedings would reveal even more victims and expose a network of corruption that extended far beyond Robert's individual crimes. The investigation into Robert's activities led to the discovery of at least 12 other victims who had been defrauded, blackmailed, or exploited by his construction company over the past 3 decades. Several elderly clients had lost their life savings to Robert's schemes, while others had been coerced into signing fraudulent contracts or providing sexual favors in exchange for construction work. One of the most disturbing discoveries was that Robert had been using his access to clients' homes during renovation projects to plant hidden cameras and recording devices, gathering compromising information that he later used for blackmail purposes. The FBI also discovered that Robert had been working with several other contractors and city officials to rig bidding processes for government construction contracts, stealing millions of dollars from taxpayer-funded housing programs designed to help low-income families. Robert's criminal network included corrupt building inspectors, fraudulent suppliers, and money laundering operations that had allowed him to hide his stolen assets in offshore accounts and real estate investments. The scope of Robert's crimes was so extensive that the FBI investigation continued for over a year, ultimately resulting in the arrests of 14 other individuals who had participated in various aspects of his criminal enterprise. During Robert's trial, Martha's testimony was the most powerful and heartbreaking evidence presented to the jury. Despite 30 years of imprisonment and torture, she was able to provide detailed, coherent accounts of Robert's crimes and the systematic cruelty he had inflicted on her and other victims. Martha described how Robert had used her imprisonment as a form of psychological warfare, constantly threatening to kill her while also promising that someday he might release her if she remained silent about his crimes. She explained how he had deliberately kept her weak and sick to prevent escape attempts, while providing just enough food and medical care to keep her alive. The jury also heard testimony from Robert's other victims, including elderly clients who had been defrauded of their retirement savings and community members who had been blackmailed into silence about Robert's criminal activities. Medical experts testified about the severe physical and psychological damage caused by Martha's 30-year imprisonment, explaining that her recovery would be a long and difficult process that might never fully restore her health and mental well-being. But the most powerful moment in the trial came when Martha looked directly at Robert and told him that despite everything he had done to her, she had never stopped believing that someday justice would be served and his crimes would be exposed. After deliberating for less than 4 hours, the jury found Robert guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling his crimes among the most heinous and calculated acts of cruelty she had ever encountered in her judicial career. But for me, the legal victory was just the beginning of a much longer process of healing and trying to understand how I had lived for 32 years with a monster without ever suspecting the truth. The discovery that my entire marriage had been built on lies and that I had unknowingly been living above a torture chamber was devastating beyond description. I struggled with guilt about not somehow sensing Martha's presence or finding ways to discover Robert's crimes sooner. Therapy helped me understand that Robert was a master manipulator who had spent decades perfecting his ability to deceive and exploit the people closest to him. The same skills that allowed him to defraud clients and evade law enforcement for 30 years had enabled him to maintain his false persona as a loving husband while hiding his true nature as a predator and criminal. Martha and I developed an unexpected friendship during her recovery process. Despite everything she had endured, she showed remarkable strength and compassion, even telling me that she didn't blame me for Robert's crimes and that she was grateful I had finally found her. Martha's recovery was slow and difficult, but with proper medical care, therapy, and the support of victim advocates, she gradually regained her physical health and began rebuilding her life after 30 years of imprisonment. The state of Oregon provided Martha with substantial compensation for her suffering, funded by the seizure and sale of Robert's criminal assets. She used the money to establish a foundation that helps other victims of domestic violence and imprisonment, turning her tragic experience into a force for helping other survivors. Martha also worked with law enforcement agencies to develop new protocols for investigating missing persons cases and detecting signs of long-term imprisonment that might have revealed her captivity sooner if the proper systems had been in place. Today, 4 years after Robert's conviction, Martha has her own apartment, has reconnected with surviving family members, and has become a powerful advocate for victims' rights and criminal justice reform. I sold the house where Martha had been imprisoned and donated the proceeds to her foundation. I couldn't continue living in a place where such horror had occurred, and I wanted to ensure that something positive came from the property where so much suffering had taken place. My relationship with my children and grandchildren was initially strained by the revelation of Robert's crimes, but therapy and time have helped us work through the complex emotions and trauma caused by discovering that our family patriarch was a criminal and predator. We've learned to separate the man we thought we knew from the monster he actually was, and to understand that Robert's crimes don't reflect on our family's values or character. Share this story if it moved you, because there are other victims of long-term imprisonment and domestic violence who need our support and advocacy to escape their situations and rebuild their lives. The investigation into Robert's crimes led to significant reforms in how missing persons cases are handled and how law enforcement agencies investigate reports of suspicious disappearances. Martha's case demonstrated that victims can be hidden in plain sight for decades, and that more aggressive investigation techniques might have saved her years of suffering. Building inspection and contractor licensing procedures have also been strengthened to prevent criminals from using legitimate businesses as covers for fraud and exploitation schemes. Most importantly, Martha's survival and recovery have inspired other victims of long-term imprisonment and domestic violence to come forward and seek help, leading to the rescue of several other victims who had been trapped in similar situations. Robert continues to serve his life sentence and has shown no remorse for his crimes or interest in providing information that might help other victims or law enforcement agencies. Martha, meanwhile, has become a symbol of survival and resilience, proving that even the most horrific trauma can be overcome with proper support, medical care, and the determination to rebuild a meaningful life. Sometimes the most evil acts are committed by the people we trust most, hiding in plain sight behind masks of respectability and charm. But sometimes, when the truth finally comes to light, justice can be served, and survivors can find the strength to transform their suffering into a force for protecting and helping others. Martha spent 30 years as a victim, but she spent the last 4 years as a survivor, advocate, and inspiration to everyone who has faced seemingly impossible challenges and refused to give up hope. That's the power of human resilience and the importance of never stopping the fight for justice, no matter how long it takes or how powerful the people responsible for the crimes might seem. The basement where Martha was imprisoned has been completely demolished, and the space has been converted into a memorial garden dedicated to victims of domestic violence and long-term imprisonment. Every spring, Martha plants flowers there to honor other victims who never had the chance to escape their captors or see justice served. It's a reminder that behind every story of survival is a community of people who refuse to give up hope and never stopped fighting for the truth.